Shock waves at dawn. An unseen network falls as a quiet American city wakes up to a truth it never wanted to face. The sirens did not scream at first, they whispered. In the pale blue hour before sunrise, when the city still believed it was safe inside its routines, unmarked vehicles rolled through familiar streets with the patience of something inevitable. From the outside, nothing distinguished this morning from any other. Porch lights glowed, a newspaper thudded against a driveway. Somewhere, a coffee machine began its daily work. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, a carefully constructed illusion was about to collapse, and with it, a story that would force a nation to look at itself without the comfort of excuses. The operation had taken years to assemble, though few would ever appreciate the discipline required to wait. Investigators had learned early that haste was the enemy. The network they were tracking did not announce itself with gunfire or public displays of power. It lived quietly, hiding behind community events, small businesses, family gatherings, and religious celebrations. It understood something essential about modern life. The loudest crimes are often the easiest to catch, while the most devastating ones prefer silence. From the third-floor window of a modest apartment building, a man watched the street with the calm of someone who believed he understood the rules. He had lived in this city long enough to know its rhythms, its blind spots, and its appetite for denial. To him, the cars outside looked like any other early commuters. He did not notice the way they spaced themselves. He did not recognize the subtle choreography that suggested preparation rather than coincidence. He was certain that if danger came, it would announce itself clearly. That certainty would prove costly. The agents, trained to suppress emotion, felt the familiar tightening in their chests. Every operation carried risk, but this one carried weight. They were not simply executing warrants. They were stepping into a narrative that many preferred not to tell. For years, reports had been dismissed as exaggerated or politically motivated. Community leaders had warned against stigmatization, and politicians had urged patience, dialogue, and restraint. Meanwhile, overdoses climbed, emergency rooms filled, and families learned the sharp vocabulary of grief. The city had grown used to mourning in fragments, never asking who was assembling the puzzle. The first door came down with a controlled violence that shattered the illusion of normalcy. Wood splintered, alarms screamed, shouts filled the hallway, sharp and precise. Inside, confusion reigned for exactly 12 seconds, long enough for panic to bloom, short enough to be useless. Hands were raised, children cried. A woman clutched a phone she would never finish dialing. The man at the window froze, his certainty dissolving into disbelief. The rules he thought he understood had changed, without consulting him. As agents moved through the rooms, the contrast was unsettling. Family photographs lined the walls. Birthdays, graduations, weddings. A child's drawing hung crookedly near the kitchen. On the counter, half-prepared breakfast waited to be abandoned. And then there were the packages, carefully wrapped, meticulously labeled, hidden in places designed to evade casual discovery. What lay inside them was not abstract policy or political rhetoric. It was chemistry, logistics, and profit, distilled into a form that could end a life in minutes. This was not the first location, nor would it be the last. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded with mechanical precision. Doors opened, floors were secured, evidence was cataloged. In one house, an elderly man sat silently as agents worked around him, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking directly at the years he had spent convincing himself that he was only a peripheral figure. In another, a young woman argued, fiercely, invoking discrimination and misunderstanding, her words rehearsed long before this morning. Persuasion, after all, had been part of the network's survival strategy. The investigation had begun with a single anomaly, a pattern in overdose data that did not align with existing assumptions. Analysts noticed clusters that defied geography and demographics. The substances involved were unusually potent, consistent in composition, and disturbingly cheap. This was not chaos, it was supply chain management. Following that thread led to shell companies, money transfers, and social connections that formed a map of influence rather than a list of suspects. Each node revealed another, and patience proved more valuable than force. What made the network so effective was not brutality, but belonging. It recruited through trust, obligation, and shared identity. It spoke the language of mutual aid and cultural pride, while quietly monetizing despair. Those on the inside rarely described themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as providers, middlemen, survivors in a system that had never fully welcomed them. That narrative, repeated often enough, became a shield. It discouraged scrutiny from outside and dissent from within. Agents understood this psychology well. They knew that facts alone would not dismantle it. The operation had therefore been designed not just to arrest individuals, but to expose a story that thrived in the absence of daylight. That was why financial records mattered as much as seized substances. That was why community outreach teams waited in the background, ready to intervene when the shock gave way to questions. Enforcement without explanation, they knew, would only deepen the cycle. By mid-morning, the city could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. News helicopters traced lazy circles overhead. Social media filled with speculation, outrage, and denial in equal measure. Some demanded immediate explanations. Others accused the authorities of overreach. A few insisted, loudly, that the operation was proof of long-held biases rather than evidence of long-ignored crimes. The truth, as always, was less comfortable than any slogan. At a press briefing held under harsh lights, officials spoke carefully. They avoided grandstanding, sticking to verifiable facts. Quantities were listed, charges were outlined, timelines were summarized, yet even in their restraint, the implications were impossible to ignore. This was not an isolated ring, nor a momentary lapse in oversight. It was a system that had adapted, learned, and grown while the public conversation remained trapped in familiar arguments. For families who had already lost someone, the news landed with a complicated force. There was relief in knowing that the supply had been disrupted, that accountability was finally visible. But there was also anger at the years it had taken, at the warnings that had gone unheeded, at the sense that their private tragedies had not been urgent enough. Reflection, in such moments, is rarely gentle. It asks questions that have no clean answers. In a quiet interrogation room, the man from the apartment building sat across from investigators, his confidence replaced by calculation. He spoke in measured tones, acknowledging some details while minimizing others. He framed his involvement as accidental, circumstantial, misunderstood. This, too, was part of the pattern. Responsibility, when it finally arrives, often tries to negotiate. The agents listened without interruption, knowing that persuasion works best when it allows silence to do its work. What ultimately unraveled his story was not a dramatic confession, but a ledger. Numbers, dates, and names aligned too neatly to be coincidence. Transactions repeated with algorithmic regularity. Routes overlapped. Payments escalated in predictable cycles. It was the banality of the evidence that made it persuasive. Crime, stripped of its myths, often looks like administration. Outside, community leaders gathered microphones and prepared statements. Some spoke of betrayal, others of healing. A few attempted to redirect attention toward broader social failures, insisting that the arrests were symptoms rather than causes. They were not entirely wrong. Systems rarely emerge from nothing. But there was an important distinction to be made, one that the city could no longer afford to blur. Explanation is not absolution, and empathy does not require blindness. The operation's aftermath revealed another uncomfortable truth. For every person taken into custody, there were dozens who had known, suspected, or rationalized. Silence, it turned out, had been the most abundant resource. Neighbors had noticed unusual traffic, employees had questioned odd instructions, friends had wondered about sudden wealth. Each time, the thought had been pushed aside in favor of social harmony. Reflection now demanded an honest inventory of those small decisions. In the weeks that followed, courtrooms filled with arguments about jurisdiction, procedure, and intent. Defense attorneys crafted narratives of overreach and cultural misunderstanding. Prosecutors responded with timelines and corroboration. Judges listened, aware that their rulings would echo far beyond the cases at hand. Justice, in this context, was not a spectacle. It was a slow, deliberate process that resisted simplification. The city itself seemed to change subtly. Conversations grew more cautious, more curious. Public forums filled with residents who had never attended one before. Some asked how such a network could exist undetected. Others asked how many more did. The most difficult questions, however, were the quiet ones. What had been gained by looking away, and what would it cost to keep looking forward? From a journalistic standpoint, the story resisted easy framing. It was tempting to reduce it to villains and heroes, raids and seizures, headlines and sound bites. Yet doing so would miss the deeper lesson. The most persuasive truths are rarely shouted, they are revealed through accumulation. Detail by detail, pattern by pattern, this story argued that complexity is not an excuse for inaction. Years from now, the dawn of that morning would be remembered less for the sirens than for what followed them. Policies would be revised, oversight mechanisms strengthened, some programs would succeed, others fail. That, too, was inevitable. But the narrative had shifted. The city had been forced to confront the gap between its self-image and its realities. In the end, the operation's true impact could not be measured solely in arrests or seizures. It lay in the collective pause it created, a moment when denial lost its grip and reflection became unavoidable. The network had thrived in shadows, but its exposure illuminated something far more important: the cost of comfort, the danger of silence, and the responsibility shared by those who benefit from order without questioning how it is maintained. As the city settled back into its routines, something lingered in the air, subtle but persistent. It was the awareness that normalcy is not a guarantee, but a choice reinforced daily. The morning that began like any other had ended with a reckoning. And in that reckoning, an invitation remained open, to see clearly, to speak honestly, and to understand that the most shocking stories are often the ones that reveal what has been in front of us all along. The days that followed did not bring closure, they brought gravity. Court filings stacked into binders thick enough to strain shelves, and each page carried the quiet weight of decisions made long before the raid. Names that once meant nothing to the broader public began to circulate with uncomfortable familiarity. They appeared in indictments, in financial disclosures, in transcripts that revealed how ordinary conversations had concealed extraordinary harm. The city read these documents the way one reads an autopsy, carefully, reluctantly, searching for the precise moment when intervention might have changed the outcome. Inside the detention center, time slowed into something almost viscous. Those arrested learned quickly that shock fades, replaced by the long arithmetic of consequences. Alliances frayed, stories diverged. Some chose cooperation, driven less by remorse than by the cold logic of self-preservation. Others clung to silence, convinced that loyalty, even now, would offer protection. The system they had relied upon for years, however, had already demonstrated its limits. Trust, once transactional, became a liability. Investigators, for their part, resisted the temptation to declare victory. They understood that dismantling a network is not the same as dismantling a market. Supply chains are opportunistic. They reroute, rebrand, and reappear wherever demand remains unchallenged. What mattered now was not only enforcement, but endurance. The willingness to apply pressure consistently, long after public attention drifted elsewhere. This was the unglamorous phase of justice, where persistence mattered more than headlines. In community centers and school gyms, meetings stretched late into the evening. Parents spoke about fear with a candor they had once avoided. Educators described warning signs they wished they had recognized sooner. Health workers explained again and again how potency had outpaced awareness, how a single miscalculation could erase a future. These conversations were not neat, nor were they always polite. Reflection rarely is. Yet something shifted in their repetition, a recognition that prevention is a collective discipline, not a delegated task. Media coverage evolved as well. The initial urgency gave way to analysis, then to quieter reporting that traced the long arcs of cause and effect. Journalists followed the money further, uncovering links that extended beyond city limits. They interviewed former participants who spoke in the language of hindsight, describing how incremental choices had accumulated into inevitability. The story grew less sensational and more unsettling, precisely because it refused to simplify. For the city's leadership, the reckoning was political as much as moral. Budgets were re-examined, priorities reordered. Programs once considered optional suddenly appeared essential. There were missteps, there always are. But there was also a discernible effort to replace rhetoric with metrics, promises with accountability. The lesson had been delivered harshly, but it had been received. Months later, when the trials began in earnest, the courtroom atmosphere was almost subdued. The drama had already occurred. What remained was documentation. Witnesses testified with the measured precision of those who knew their words would be parsed line by line. Exhibits spoke for themselves. Jurors listened, absorbing the cumulative effect of evidence that left little room for interpretation. Justice, when it finally moved, did so with a deliberate calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of that first morning. Outside, life continued. Children went to school. Businesses opened and closed. New residents arrived, unaware of how recently the city had been forced to confront itself. Yet, beneath the surface, memory persisted. It shaped policy discussions, informed personal choices, and lingered in the cautious optimism of those who had learned that safety is not inherited, it is maintained. The story, in the end, did not resolve into triumph or tragedy alone. It settled into something more demanding: responsibility. The raid had exposed a network, but the aftermath exposed a truth even harder to ignore: that vigilance is an ongoing act, and reflection is only meaningful when it changes behavior. The city had been given a rare, uncomfortable clarity. What it chose to do with that clarity would determine whether the shock of that dawn became merely another headline or the beginning of a more honest future.